This conference will now be recorded.
And that way we can make the recording of this available. And Ms. Ashley has already graciously agreed to let us record it and share that recording with our members for those who, for whatever reason, couldn't make it but would like to see not only the presentation deck that she's going to share with us about the PowerPoint, but also the recording of it. So that'll be there as well, but it is being recorded. So that's my very quick technical preliminary. I'll turn it over to Janice. You can go ahead and start us out.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janice Bredman, and I am the president for the Columbus chapter ARMA, ARMA group, or ARMA professionals. Hopefully everyone is safe and healthy, whether you're working from home or for those of us who have gone back into the office, because some of us have. But whatever our work status is, we wish you, the board wish you health and safety for you and for your family. This is our first meeting for 2020, and as we all know, and as we've all been doing, it's virtual. So I'm sure you all didn't expect anything different. Today's speaker is Lori Ashley, and I am going to hand the quote unquote mic over to Perry Swift, who will introduce our speaker for the next hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Well, today I have the privilege of introducing our speaker, Lori Ashley, whom I have known for a number of years now through various professional circles, and I knew who she was even before I met her in person through her work in electronic records. Lori is the Industry Market Development Manager for Preservica, which is a UK-based digital preservation software as a service and on-premise solution provider. There, she is responsible for identifying cross-industry and sector requirements and developing compelling use cases to advance digital preservation capabilities and solutions. Before she joined Preservica in 2017, she was an independent consultant providing records and information management advice and education to more than 100 public and private sector organizations. She has served as the Data, Forms, and Records Coordinator for the State of Wisconsin Department of Electronic Government, supporting state and local government forms and records officers and data administrators in their implementation of statutory requirements, policies, and best practice standards. And before her public sector service, she worked for more than a decade as a business and regulatory strategist in the energy industry. Lori has co-developed 4 continuous improvement methodologies, including a capability maturity model developed by Dr. Charles Dollar for long-term digital preservation and access. The digital preservation capability maturity model, which she'll talk about today, was adapted into a self-assessment tool for use by members of the Council of State Archivists. Lori's also taught graduate courses in records management for the University of Wisconsin and the Master of Archival Science program at Clayton State University in Georgia. She's an active member of AIM, ARMA, NAGARA, the Society of American Archivists, and is a frequent speaker, and we are so happy that she is joining us at Greater Columbus ARMA today. Thank you, Lori.
Thanks, Perry. It's always strange to hear an introduction of oneself, a little rundown of where I've been, and I will cover a few of those points. Oh, good. I need to share my screen here. Mark's made me the presenter, so let's just, okay, why don't you signal to me if you can see my screen, and let me just move, how do I move this over here? Collapse that. Okay. Can you see my title screen?
This is Mark. I can see it.
In slide mode.
And it is now in slide presentation mode is what I'm seeing.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me today. Thanks to Perry for an introduction to Mark, and for Mark to pass along a couple of possibilities for a presentation today. As Perry said, I work for Preservica, a software solution provider, but I'm really here today in a different role, the role I had before joining Preservica, but my affiliation with Preservica I will explain, and it's tied to this presentation today, which is to share with you a capability maturity model approach that Dr. Charles and I developed now more than 10 years ago, and to see if it sparks any interest is useful to use. So I'll explain. So there's one slide from Preservica. All the rest of it is really me speaking as co-developer of DPCMM, or the Digital Preservation Capability Maturity Model. So just a few slides to start out with to set the groundwork for what is digital preservation and why is it important. A few minutes on how the heck did I get to the point in my career where I'm focused nearly exclusively on long-term and permanent electronic records. Share with you the capability maturity model, its basic components, and that digital web-based self-assessment tool, which you're welcome to use. I have one slide on a call to action, which really highlights how I think that IG and RIM professionals and practitioners can play such an important role in engaging their organizations in approaching long-term records preservation in the electronic sphere. And then, as Mark indicated to me, the interest from the board was really around the case study. So I'll show you some ways in which the DPCMM model has been used. The digital K-Web assessment has been used by more than 250 organizations. And I just want to make it clear, it's a separate thing from Preservica. None of the data that is ever submitted through the self-assessment web tool is shared with Preservica, even though it's, of course, a lot of organizations and people who are needing digital preservation. It was started long before I joined Preservica, and it's completely separate. The data is never shared with anyone. And since Dr. Dollar has retired, it really is only in my control. A few summary remarks and then some resources. I sent a couple of PDF resources, things that I authored, to Mark to share with you. And then there are also some links for public websites that might point you to some resources if you're interested in pursuing this further. So just to baseline, digital fragility is an issue by consensus. We all know that electronic assets require more care and attention and monitoring than those in paper or film. They also, electronic assets are not readable except with the help of machines. And of course, hardware and software is a constantly changing sort of environment. So technology refresh cycles happen, things get broken, storage media can degrade. Vendors can walk away from an application, or they can discontinue support for a proprietary file format. And then, of course, just the natural course of organizational changes and development, we end up with applications with data that are no longer being used because we've moved on to something else. And of course, people change their roles as well. So someone who may have been an expert in a particular system may have moved on. And so a different custodian has to take over who may or may not know some of the specifics of a specific environment. The analysts in the industry, so Gartner and Forrester and a company out of Canada, Infotech, have all recognized that our reliance on digital media makes us quite vulnerable. And so as practitioners in this area, I'm sure if you consult your retention schedules, you'll note lots of things which are potentially in need and at risk from degradation in the electronic environment. So that's what I hope to share with you today, a model that can help highlight some of those risks and hopefully advance your organization's embrace of what needs to be done. More specifically, these are risks to long-term digital information. A big one is where we lose the context, and this is an important one, of course, for records managers and archivists. Archivists often end up with content that doesn't have very good metadata associated with it, and they're always chasing after adding metadata in order to make the files understandable well into the future. Chain of custody can sometimes be broken either inside an organization or between companies, depending on the life cycle. Perry mentioned that I worked in the energy industry. The last job I had was in the high voltage transmission company. And when I asked one of the engineers the oldest asset in the field, he said that it was 70 years old and there was no plan for it to be decommissioned or retired. So we, by the nature of our work, the important things that you do and the organizations that you serve, handle a lot of information that needs to hang around for a long period of time. And that's outside the archival community. And so a lot of things can happen over that time. Bits and bytes become corrupt just sitting on servers. Sometimes, often, too often, I guess, we move on to new applications and we are stuck with legacy applications without a clear sense of maybe what's in them and without a plan for moving things forward. And of course, there's always a shortage of time and money, and so sometimes when decommissioning initiatives happen, there's a lot of pressure not to move a lot of data forward, but inevitably there are some assets in legacy applications which have continuing retention requirements. And then of course, just the natural evolution in organizations where maybe there's a new lines of business, or there's a change in leadership, change in personalities, and so priorities and resources can shift over time, putting at risk some long-term digital content. How long is long-term is always a good question to start with. This is a view of a poster I did and presented at ARMA Canada in 2015, so it tells you a little bit about how long I've been on this soapbox. In the digital preservation community, we use a longer than 10 years as long-term and potentially needing support or transformation to keep viable. And these are two points of reference for you. The ISO standard, which I'll talk a little bit about, which is used by the digital preservation community, defines long-term as long enough to be concerned with the impacts of changing technologies or a changing user community. And it can be permanent, it can be indefinite. And so I think in your own environment, and maybe Mark would be happy to comment on this, different organizations and different industries have different cycles, but it's fair to say that technology refresh cycles run about a 3-year cycle. So if you have a 10-year record, it means that it may already be subject to several technology refresh cycles, and you might want to think about potentially taking a disposition action, transforming it to a different file format, or moving into an environment that's specifically suited for keeping something alive. There was a study done in 2007 by the Storage Network Industry Association, SNIA, on the 100-year archive study requirements, and their definition of long-term came out pretty much in anything beyond 10 to 15 years, because that's when it gets difficult to maintain control of logical and physical migrations. They tried to do an updated study in 2017, but they didn't get enough participants to update that study. So that's the best one I have is 2007. So you all know we only have a few options if we're talking about records preservation, especially long-term or permanent records preservation. These are some screenshots from the municipal record retention for the state of Pennsylvania, and I spend a lot of time looking at county government these days. And the state archives in Pennsylvania last April, approved for the first time municipal organizations being able to store permanent municipal records in electronic format, and they specified that it would be PDFA. So what you see here is you basically have paper, film, or digital. And if it's going to be digital, then you're going to have to pay a special attention because, as I said, you can't read it without a computer, and computer software and hardware is always changing underneath us. Paper and film are, eye-readable, pretty durable media, and we have lots of standards and good practices around them. So if you want to take a look at what Pennsylvania has done, they require a notification to the state archives if a municipality wants to store their permanent electronic records in PDFA format. So what does it mean to future-proof electronic records? It means long-term error-free storage, which is, not especially easy to do, given all the things that I just explained, so that you can retrieve it, you can interpret it, and you can prove that it's authentic. Goes back to what the original was for the entire time that the information is required. And of course, it applies to born digital content, which is a lot of what we're dealing with today. Lots of different file formats, as well as anything that's been converted from an analog format. And there are thousands and thousands of digitization projects going on for both operational and historical records. So there's a lot of content that potentially needs to be future-proofed using electronic tools. So what is digital preservation more specifically? Not surprisingly, it's people, process, and technologies, or policy, strategies, and actions that ensure access to digital content over time. So the real emphasis in digital preservation is access, that we take these actions on a select set of objects that we want to have accessible in the future. And archives do that for users that haven't been born yet, for the purposes of historical preservation and perspective. There's an even much longer definition. I've only shared here the medium and the short. but it's what you basically are trying to do is overcome the challenges of technology obsolescence in order to keep that content authentic, usable, have integrity over time, whatever time frame that is and makes sense for your organization. So I just want to point out two standards. There's more, but the two main standards that are useful to reference in this space are ISO 14721 and 16363. So this one is called the Open Archival Information System Reference Model. It's not an implementation model, it's a reference model. And it was developed initially in the space science arena. It was an international effort because people send up satellites and have lots of space data, and they want to be able to share it with across country and borders. And so they got together and developed a standard which has now been updated. So the term Open Archival Information, or OIAS is how it's referred to, stands for an archive consisting of people and systems that have accepted responsibility to preserve information and to make it available for a designated community. And the designated community part means it's unlikely that your organization will take on the responsibility for keeping assets alive forever for everyone, right? And so what the designated community says is that you, if you're an academic institution, a research center, a state archive, a commercial organization, that you do what you do for a specific set of users and not the whole world. And so this OIAS, this trusted repository, which combines, people and process and technologies in order to keep the assets alive, are done for a specific purpose, under certain criteria. And so this has been adopted by the worldwide digital preservation community. There is you can buy it through the ISO books or store, but you can also get a free copy, and that link is down at the bottom. It's quite a hefty document, but if anybody in IT is wondering, is there a standard which describes what a preservation environment is, this is the place to send them. A companion standard, ISO 16363, was developed a number of years later, and it is the audit and certification of TDRs, trustworthy digital repositories. And the reason why this came about is it's one thing to say that you can keep stuff forever in digital form. It's another thing to prove it. And so this is a 16363 is a way for organizations to certify to the public or to the world that they've got all the things in place that are necessary. And it's not, you don't typically audit an entire organization. They point specifically at a repository and specific collections. And this one is also available free via that link. 16363 has a couple different sections. It talks about organizational infrastructure, data object management, and then risk management infrastructure. So in the model that I'm going to show you, the digital preservation capability model, we tackle some of these things. The model is based on these two standards, 14721 and 16363, but obviously it can't tackle everything. And one of the things that you won't see in the model that I'll show you is on funding, which is, of course, a challenging topic. The organization that is certified to come in and audit repositories against the standard is called PTAB, and it's made up of people who helped write the two standards. And they have a spreadsheet with basically all of the requirements from this standard that you could use as a self-assessment tool. And so that link is there at the bottom of the screen. There are only two organizations in the world that have been certified so far to 16363. One is in India. The first was in India. And the second one is here in the US. And so it's a great place to go if you're looking for what the heck is this and why would they go about doing this. And it's our own government publishing office. So this is where all the federal government's official documents, the publications of Congress and the White House and other federal agencies are stored. It's the depository also for the libraries in the US. And so they spent a number of years building their own system, which is called GovInfo. And you can see here some of the holdings that they have. And then they have two instances, which is a requirement in digital preservation, 2 or 3, an instance, a primary instance, and then a continuity of operations. So it's great to have an exemplar, somebody who's gone before us, and there are some materials available on their website so you can see why did they do it and what did they do, and then in a couple of years PTAB will go back and see how they're holding up. I wanted to talk just a few minutes about my professional journey to this point. I'm, somewhere near the end of my career, and decided 3 years ago when I joined Preservica that I would spend the rest of my career focused on digital preservation, because I think it's so very important, and to try to leverage all the things I've learned and heard and seen and shared with others like Perry along the way, to try to see if I couldn't help move things forward. And I joined Preservica because it had a commercial product, which is purpose-built to the OIS standard. There are over 200 customers now. So they had something that was ready to go. So if people are able to say, I can build a business case for a digital preservation tool, Preservica has it ready, which is why I joined them. But as Perry said, I worked in the utility industry for a number of years, and I was there during Y2K and thought, we've got to be able to do better connecting the dots between the systems that are in place and the users and what they need. And at that time, IT group didn't really even know all the applications that it had. And so I began to get really interested in the process, the connection between the systems we used to support our work and how the work was getting done. So I had a role as a business strategist and also as an organizational development support person, which means you look at how the company is actually running. Are things working well? And so I was involved in employee surveys and voice of the customer, and just again, lots of disconnects between the tools we have, the business we need to get done, and where the information is managed and stored. My last foray in the utility industry was at the high voltage transmission company, and by then I had gotten really interested in records management from a great mentor, Arliss Vogel, who some of you may know was a longtime ARMA member while I was at Wisconsin Energy. And so I went to the transmission company, which was this consolidation of transmission assets in Wisconsin and a little bit in Michigan, in order to be prepared to advance the transmission system. More transmission was needed. And so they took the assets from these various companies and put them together. And what I saw was this amazing opportunity to get a records management program right from the start. And I tried, and it didn't work. And I thought, okay, something else must be able to be possible. But if you can't do it at a startup, when the heck can you get records management right? So I went from there to the Department of Electronic Government, which only lasted a really short time. It was a couple of components of the Department of Administration. And as soon as the governors changed, those parts of DOA went back. I had a role as an information domain manager, which gave me, again, an enterprise view into how information could be governed and managed. And it was pretty hard going. But what I did develop in state service was this deep, deep appreciation for policy development and consensus building, the challenges of enterprise technology and the revolving door of state CIOs, how the Public Records Board worked, like the stakeholders coming together, especially on the historical side, to establish retention schedules and to monitor the disposition of records. Developed a lot of great relationships, and that's when I joined the ARMA Madison chapter and have been active in a number of leadership roles there over the years. From there, I went on to Cohasset Associates, which is a consulting firm. And so you can see down below the kinds of projects that I worked on for all those different organizations, public and private, and then did some teaching. And I really came to the conclusion, I naively thought we were going to get our handle on electronic records management and email management sooner than we have. But I did see a real gap in conversation and advocacy around long-term electronic records. And decided that I wanted to spend more time on that. So as Perry said, I'm constantly looking for ways we can do things better and connect the parts. So I've done a couple of different frameworks, ending up with the digital preservation capability maturity model, which is what I want to talk to you about now. So I'm sure you're all familiar, especially based on ARMA's maturity models, that it's evolved over the years, but it's a management tool. It's a great benchmarking tool. It's a way to say, how systematic and uniform are we doing in something that's important to us? It came out of the software development world, but it basically gives you a framework, a way to measure and manage. And I think it's really a good way to get people sitting around the table and debating where's our organization in terms of its capabilities to do whatever you're looking at, and how good do we need to be? So this is, this was the another model that was going on at the time we were developing the capability maturity model, which started out in 2007 and really became something significant in 2010, and I'll explain that. So the digital preservation capability maturity model, or DPCMM, has 15 components. And the way it works is you sort of go through each one and assess your organization or the repository that you're looking at against each of these. And I'm going to take a run through the first 8 with you using the self-assessment tool, because all of the rest, 9 through 15, really presume that you have a preservation repository. And so what typically happens is if you don't have something that's built or the pieces put together to do something like what the reference model tells you, you get kind of low scores. So I welcome you to take a look at that, but I want to get you oriented by going through the first set of these. So this is what the pictures look like. We never did spend much money on a graphic artist, so it's really kind of an ugly, ugly graphic. But we broke the 15 components into infrastructure, which tend to be more about organizational issues. And then the bottom section of things that happen inside the technology, we call those services. And in the middle is a place where you put this stuff, which has a requirement for long-term preservation. What you see on the sides, the producer and consumer, these are terms out of the OAS model. The producers are anybody who creates content. It could be a donor, or it could be a departmental unit. It could be a system. Somehow somebody's creating content that needs to be protected. And then consumers are the ones who, in the future, want access to objects which are stored in the repository. And so they make a request, and then the material is made available to them. Never the original, but they're able to render the content and see it. So that's basically the model. You're probably really familiar with the stages of the GARP model, or the generally accepted record keeping, or the IG maturity model. So this is how we set up the sort of the thresholds in this model. So there are 5 levels, and at the very bottom, at the nominal level, it means that most, if not all, electronic records that merit long-term preservation are at risk. And then at the top, at optimal, which I think the only organization that we ever had use the survey that tested close to the optimal level was the Church of Latter-day Saints, and the the repository they have for genealogical data. They have pretty much things locked down, but everybody else is somewhere in the middle. And I'll show you some examples of where different organizations scored and what they did about it. So the point of having this self-assessment, lots of people, librarians, archivists, records managers, engineers, researchers, understand the need to get access to data or records a long time after they were created. But it's often hard to build the business case, to argue when things ought to move out of an operational environment into a preservation environment, to explain to people what it takes, or to become familiar with the technology. So the point of this, Charles and I were trying to help practitioners make some noise, have a way of explaining to stakeholders that this was something that needed to happen in the records life cycle for electronic information that needed to be kept long term. And it allows, if you work with peer organizations, it allows you to sort of trade and share and compare notes. And the whole point of it was to get momentum for people like you who are charged with records management or information governance. And there's a select set of these assets that you care about and that you're charged with advocating for and protecting and advising stakeholders on, that have these requirements. And the electronic environment is just really challenging, more challenging than any one that we've encountered. And our very high reliance on it these days makes us very vulnerable if we don't take some action. So this is all about giving a simple to use tool, a boiled down version of a couple of standards, put it in the hands of people who hopefully could make some noise at their organizations. We presented a couple of years ago at NERMA, the Nuclear Information and Records Management Association. So we worked up a hypothetical not too long ago, organizations who belong to NERMA were focused on implementing ECM systems. It seems like it's taken us a long time to get some of these systems up and running. So what we did was we just used a hypothetical of an organization that's using a commercial records management application certified to DoD 5015.2, and to try to see how did it measure up. We assume that the organization has up-to-date retention schedules, which is not always the case. And of course, an organization operating in this arena has a lot of obligations for long-term records, which may be tied to the life of a facility or a piece of equipment or technology, and that they have reporting relationships to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So when you look at, we made some assumptions. This is a look at the scorecard that comes out of the digital preservation capability and maturity model. The max score, if you scored optimal in all 15 components, would get you a score of 60. So you can see that that in this hypothetical case, the score is 13 out of 60. And the question you have to ask is this good enough? And honestly, being an outsider to a nuclear company, I would say, heck no. It really needs to be better than this, right? So that's one of the questions, is how good is good enough? So this is the login for digitalok.org is the name of the self-assessment web-based tool that's built on our model. And it came about because in 2012 and 2015, this tool was used by all members of the U.S. Council of State Archivists. So that's the 56 U.S. states and territories in the District of Columbia, as a way of creating a community and a benchmark. And so we asked for permission to use the software code and develop a public version, which they agreed to do if we kept it open and free for 4 years, which we've now kept it open and free for 7 years. So you just log in, and again, I'm the only person behind this application. So all we do is just try to make sure a real person is asking for it, but it comes to me and I just approve it, and then you're free to use the web-based tool. So we ask for a little bit of information: name, title, organization, repository. This is a really important thing. If you just generically say, I'm going to test my whole organization, you're going to get some really weird results. So you really need to say, I'm pointing my attention at some place where long-term records are stored. It could be a file server. In this case, we use the commercial software, and then we ask a question of, does your repository conform to ISO? And that's to signal to people that this is what this self-assessment is based on. And then we, ask some information. Are you using any of these tools? So you'll see SharePoint or DSpace, some of the things, Archivematica, commercial and open source tools that are commonly used in the space, just to see what people are relying on. So basically you go in and it just gives you an intro message. You click and you can get into the survey and stop it and then come back to it. So what I want to do is just run you through the first couple of components and give you an idea of how it works. And there's a scoring logic that's running behind it. So at the end of it, you get a calculated score and an output. So the first thing is digital preservation policy, this is really different from having a records retention schedule. It says that if you've got long-term or permanent electronic records, that needs to be made explicit. People need to understand that there's something to do, and that there's compliance to be followed. And this is kind of an interesting question, because who does it, right? Is it the people, the producers, the agency, the department? Are they responsible for taking care of it? Is it IT's job? Is it an outside company that's going to take care of it? So having a high-level policy says we take care of our long-term electronic records by taking specific actions. And so these are the questions. We don't have a policy. We have one in practice. It's disseminated. We look at it regularly, or we allow it to be audited. So that's just kind of the format of this. You go through the 15 components, you do a checkbox, and you get to the end. So the second component is a strategy. So of course, technology is always changing. So whatever you might decide is your strategy. Say you're going to store everything you can, you're going to transform it to PDFA, and that's going to be your digital preservation strategy. Well, that's probably not going to, first of all, it's not the only thing that you have to do, because that has to be stored someplace and the environment makes a difference. but you can't store everything that's long-term in PDFA, and technology is changing. So what are you going to do? What formats are you going to store it in? Where are you going to put it? Is it going to be ad hoc? Are you going to, give people direction, make it explicit who's accountable for it? If you dictate that people will transform things to a format, you need to tell them what that is. So one of the resources at the end is the U.S. National Archives Digital Preservation Framework, and they've identified 2 agencies that are sending them electronic content, which will be all the content pretty soon when the deadlines come up. They've specified the preferred and supported formats for, I think it's 15 or 16 different categories. If you're sending us audiovisual, or you're sending us text documents, if you're sending us spatial data, this is the way that we want it to come to NARA. So it's similar, and I can point you to lots of places, academic institutions and state archives and other places, that their strategy is to ask the producers to transform it to a technology neutral file format before they pass it on. You may or may not choose to do that. So that's what this one is all about. And Preservica is sponsoring a research project. This is the 2nd year of the project on interagency electronic records transfer in state government. And this year's project is looking at a handful of good practice examples. And there will be a report coming out. The project is called Move It, and it stands for Modeling Viable Electronic Information Transfer. And we'll put out the project report, or COSA will, in January 21. So you can follow this link to get information. And there was a recent webinar, so you can find more information about that. Unfortunately, a lot of the transfer is still quite manual, which we've got to get beyond because there's too much digital content to take care of. Governance, so this is about who's accountable. How do you keep the pieces going? How do you keep a clear vision of all the places where long-term records may be captured and managed in your organization, and link them to all the other mechanisms of, when we get a new application, this is what we do. If it has permanent records in it, this is the kind of protocol we put in place. So this ties nicely into information governance. And one of the resources I provided to Mark is a paper I wrote for ARMA Canada on integrating digital preservation into your information governance program. So that might give you some ideas of what could be done. You can't do this on your own. Not only does it take technology, but it takes communication and collaboration between those that make records and have an expectation of getting access to them into the future, with people like yourselves who are counsels and counselors and advocates and advisors and subject matter experts in records management. And oftentimes what happens too is that there's a community, so that academic institutions doing digital preservation, say in a statewide system, will have a group that gets together to focus on this so that they can share lessons learned. And so this component is about who are you working with, how are you engaging with others, how are you leveraging the expertise of other folks to keep your program moving forward. The model has a lot of emphasis on using open standard technology tools, but basically what you'll find is that many IT people are not really familiar with digital preservation. It wasn't taught in their programs. They're used to migrating and archiving or backing up, but they're not aware of these ISO standards that exist, or this reference model that helps people understand what needs to be done. And so this is a question about, do folks in your organization or who support you from the outside with technical initiatives and infrastructure, are they aware of what these requirements are and some of the good practices? This one is about what's your use. It's really, really common for people to decide to transform things and save them in TIFF or JPEG. And so this takes a look at what people are using and how many of these formats they're using. This one I talked about, who are you doing this for? Are there internal folks, external folks? If you're a state archives, of course, it's for the public, but also for researchers. So it's really clear that you understand what are you going to all this trouble for, and it should help you with the appraisal and selection of the stuff that goes into a trusted repository. This is the one where I really think you folks can play such an important role, and you can leverage off retention schedules, but retention schedules, as I said, are not enough to communicate what needs to be done here. I've looked at hundreds of retention schedules in my time, and they'll say things like, who is the ultimate custodian, or, does it need to be transformed to microfilm? But basically, you can leverage your retention schedules, and if you have a data map where you're able to map, series or functional units to the systems that they're using, that's a great place to then go apply this capability maturity model and say, there's long-term stuff in there. Is this system good enough to do what we need to do? And so this component you might find most interesting. It talks about, do you do ad hoc surveys? Do you do a periodic analysis? Do you know where the content is stored? Have you published data transfer protocols so that people would know how to get something out of an operational system into a repository? And this is sort of my vision for where I hope the world will go. I probably won't live long enough to see it, but imagine that every organization has a digital preservation repository or part of their infrastructure. My view is that if a object is born permanent, that it could be potentially stored in that environment at capture or at any time during its use. As long as you don't get in the way of the users, there's no reason why you can't put an object into a preservation environment early and not wait, as we typically do, until the objects reach the end of their authorized retention period, or they're at risk, or they're ready for transfer to an archive, which is what happens. So in my world, I deal with lots and lots of archivists who just get crap, 20, 40, 50 years after this stuff was created, with very little metadata in file formats that they can no longer read. So my vision is that just as we've spent a lot of time on defensible disposition, we should be spending time on preservation by policy, and that we should find ways to take assets with high value or high risk and move them into preservation environments and hook the users to them in a transparent way, and do right by the assets, and hopefully, be smart about storage. There are lots of differences between the systems we use, purpose-built applications in a digital preservation system, so I won't bother you with that, but anything that conforms to the 14721 reference model is purpose-built to keep the stuff long-term. So I'm going to stop there and not go into these other aspects of the model, because I want to share with you some of the ways that this has been used in my remaining time. So what happens is, when you go through the digitalok.org application and you complete the survey, what you'll get is this colorful scorecard, which shows what your score is. So red is nominal, and orange is the next level, and yellow is the next level up, and then optimal is green. And it shows you, based on your answers, how your organization or that repository scores against these requirements. And then at the bottom, it will just say, based on your answers, you sort of fall in this area. And then you also get an output of all the questions and the answers that you pick, so that you can, sit down with some coworkers and debate whether or not that was the right answer, or use the printout to say, well, if we're here and we want to get to there, what does that next level suggest we would be doing? So this is my call to action to IG practitioners and RIM professionals. These are, I think, a lot of things you do in your normal work, and they are opportunities to raise awareness and to advocate for proactively addressing the long-term requirements for electronic content. So if you're trying to build a business case for upgrading a system, or somebody else is doing it, and you get to go in there and ask some questions. Legacy application decommissioning is a big one. I worked with a consultant who had built 2 e-archives in pharmaceutical companies, and they were paid for based on legacy application decommissioning. So if you stop paying for one piece of software and you can get rid of the things which have met their retention, and you have an environment to move the things that need to stay, you can use the money which is already in the, say, IT budget, but move it to use it for a preservation environment. So you shut down one and you create a new one. And these are, multi-million-dollar projects. If you get wind, or you're invited, or it's a normal course in your organization to be part of looking at requirements for new technology, and you can map that some of the assets in that new system will require long-term care and preservation. That's a great place to insert, well, at what point would we trigger the disposition to a preservation environment, or can we transform the objects in that system to a different format, which is an open standard or open technology neutral file format, so that we hedge the bet, right, on that proprietary format. Digitization projects, so we paper to digital or film to digital, which is happening a lot. And in particular, that example I gave of municipal records in Pennsylvania that can now be stored in PDFA. I talked to a gentleman who was head of building compliance. He's got 30 years of microfilm records on, building code applications and inspections and things like that. He's got a records management application, but it doesn't give him what he needs in terms of the requirements from the archive. So he was looking for, how do I do this electronic records preservation? And it was his intent in the future to transform those 30 years of files into a digital format and then put them into the repository. File classification, if you're sifting through your file shares, or you're migrating over to Office 365 and you've got to figure out what goes, what stays, it's not a bad time to identify some of those assets with long-term requirements or high value. Excuse me. And you can leverage that. They also, in file classification, they often can tell you file formats, so it can give you a view into, are there things in here that we can't read or render, and we might need to find a different place to put them so that we can actually read these files. Of course, anytime the business is shifting, moving, transferring content because of merger or acquisition, it's a chance to potentially raise your hand and make sure that those assets will be available to somebody in the future. Just educating employees. I mean, if you're getting new engineers coming into your organization, they're going to be concerned about stuff that was built in the past that they need to access to do their work. And hopefully, certain disciplines are especially tied into the longevity of their data and their work. And so it's a chance for you to educate a new batch of folks coming in. Succession planning and leadership changes. Sometimes people come into the organization and are really interested in how their legacy will be preserved. And so that's another chance for you to talk about, well, how are we going to save your email communications, your press releases, your announcements we put up on YouTube, or your tweets, or whatever it is. And then, of course, COVID-19 has accelerated a lot of harvesting, especially of websites and social media sites for archivists. So anytime there's an emergency, of course, is when records management gets a chance to make a play. So, and then breaches or audits also raise issues, raise risk, get people's attention, and it's a time when you can potentially let people know that there's some action that could be taken. So here are some use cases. I know you guys were interested in hearing about these. The most organized and largest use case was with COSA. So they initiated, their flagship program is called SIRI, the State Electronic Records Initiative, which they created in 2010. They wanted to start out by getting a profile of where the various states and territories were with their electronic records programs. So Charles and I were invited in to do kind of an informal review of the data that had been gathered through telephone surveys. And here I just wanted to give you an example of what folks run into in state government. You can see at the top there are permanent assets which are to be retained in the creating unit. So that means an agency is going to need to have preservation. And then down below, typical governor records of where they are retained and then transferred to the state archives for permanent retention after the administration's changed. So there's lots of different examples, but as I said, I believe every organization's got some need for this. I work a lot with the U.S. State Archives, but I think we're going to see more and more agencies and central IT units that are also going to need to get on board with this. So the results were really dismal in 2010 and 2011. It was a self-assessment, and 5 to 9% had a program that addressed all stages of the life cycle. It was really sort of sad. So what happened was we did an informal assessment, and sort of the composite score for the 48 that responded was 3 out of 60. So what happened was COSA decided to use the digital preservation capability maturity model, and we worked with them to develop that web-based self-assessment, which was of course geared towards state government. And so all of the 56 state territories took it in 2012 and again in 2015. And what they did after 2012 was to look at the scores, divide the states into different institutes, and then start a training program so that folks that were at the higher level were together sharing and learning, and folks that hadn't really gotten underway with electronic records management were also together and had more basic training. So these are real scorecards from 2012 and 2015 for a single organization that moved from a score of 8 out of 60 to a score of 38 out of 60. And one of the success stories, and not attributable just to DPCMM, but we certainly helped, was the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, which were able to finally, after many years of asking the legislature for money, were able to get money for the Texas Digital Archive when Rick Perry left office. And when Rick Perry left office, he had 13 years of accumulated records, many of them electronic, which had to come over and be processed and managed by the digital archive. So there's the website, and they've built it out considerably. If you want other examples of state archive, digital archives, I'd be happy to provide them to you. This is a poster from last year's Society of American Archivists conference, and I was contacted by one of the librarians at the University of Baltimore to ask to use the model, which they did. And so what you can see here from this poster session is they use the model. You can see their scorecard sort of there in the middle. Everything's a nominal with the exception of 3 components. And then they have a description of meeting with library manager or leadership, and then deciding what they were going to do about it. And so down below, you can see where they've identified how good they want to be at the various components, and then which things they were going to tackle first. And it's really common for people to take on the policy and strategy document first. When I worked with the Kentucky Department of Library and Archives, basically they had a policy, but they just hadn't really written it down and communicated it. So it isn't that you don't have one, but if it's not transparent and visible to other people, it's hard for them to join in. This is a gentleman from a Croatian government agency. It's an analog to the US Federal Drug Administration. When he first took this, his score was 32 out of 60, which is pretty good. But then you can see here on the right-hand side what some of his actions were. So for example, archival storage was to examine possibilities of geographically dispersing repositories. To do more collaboration, to collaborate with the faculty of a university to get training out there, to standardize metadata. So wherever you end up on this model, it gives you a chance to say, where do we want to be? And then to think about what are the actual items. So one of the first users of the model was the City of Toronto in 2010. And this is what their scorecard came out to be. And then this is what they took away. So year 1 and 2, they were going to focus on policy, collaboration, and governance. They were going to try to boost up their digital asset survey, do some work on that, be more explicit about designated communities. So basically, you just sort of create a trajectory of what do you want to focus on, and then you can pull together teams and then take the metric again and see how you're doing over time. And this is the one that I just added. I found the Norwegian Health Archive took the survey in 2017, and then you can see down below what they were going to focus on over 2018, 19, and 20. And then sometimes people add in, how difficult is this? It's not hard to write a policy document, but it's hard to get it implemented. So some of these things based on your resources or organizational priorities can come first or wait. So the object is you have a score, you find out where you are, and as an organization or as a repository, you decide how good do we need to be. And in the case of the government publishing office, they decided they need to be as good as possible, which is why they went after the ISO certification. So this is my personal belief and something that I've been talking about for, it seems like forever, that it's the digital preservation or the care and managing and sustainability of electronic records is a life cycle management concern, and that we should build it into the way we talk to people about taking care of things from capture to use and maintain to disposition, whether that's to another agency, to an archive, or we keep it ourselves. It takes a village, right? It takes the producers to identify what they need. It takes an understanding of who the future users are. And you can't do electronic records management without technology, and technology is a wily, and complex and powerful beast. So it really does take more than just a records management team to say this is important. And that the reason we built the model was to say it is possible to take this complex thing and to deconstruct it in a way that can bring people into the fold to talk about it, to advocate for it, to figure out what to do about it, and to make progress. So I'll leave you with some resources. Library of Congress has a sustainability of digital format document. The National Archives has a framework where they've identified preferred formats, and there's lots of other information about what they're saying about the primacy of electronic records and how we all need to sort of get on board with managing electronic things electronically for their whole lives. NDSA has a nice, real simple model of the levels of digital preservation, what you need to do to know your content and store your content and preserve your content. And then the Digital Preservation Coalition has wonderful resources. They have a handbook on digital preservation. And then last year they came out with a rapid assessment model. So again, you can look at it and say, how well are we doing? Do we have funding? Do we have stakeholder support? These are the 3 resources that I gave to Mark that I wrote. They're Preservica branded, so a brochure on why DP matters to records managers. The Essential Guide is pretty new. It's about preserving electronic government records. And then the paper that I wrote for ARMA Canada, which was published this spring. And then my one slide on Preservica, as Perry said, we have a suite of solutions hosted in the cloud or on-prem, but we're coming out soon with a really easy to use starter product that anybody can use and get something stored and preserved within a matter of minutes. So if you're interested in that, you can go from there. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and just remind you that without preservation, there can be no future access. Feel free to contact me. Feel free to use the model if you'd like. I'd love to hear your feedback on this presentation. And if you are on a digital preservation journey and you need examples of policies and procedures and other things, I would be happy to share from my vast collection. So with that, I say thank you.
Thank you. I see Janice is coming on. Go ahead, Janice.
Yes, thank you, Lori. Are there any questions for Lori? And if there are questions, don't forget to mute your mic.
I've stunned them all into silence. That happens,
Excuse me. Yes, it is. You gave us a plethora of information, a lot of information, beginning with how fragile digital information is, the risk of long-term digital information. So in my job, we focus on the risk of just holding on to information, period. But then there's also that risk of digital information that can lose its value or become high risk for the company. I like that you shared your passion with us, how you you made your executive decision to make digital presentation your career, and which to me makes you a go-to person, a person that's an expert in the field of digital information. So, or sort of like, I like to use the term guru. And just, everything else you shared is a lot of information. I'm glad we do have the capacity to record this. So anyone who wants to share this with their organization, just reach out to me and we'll be sure to get that information to you. Or Mark will probably put it on our webpage. But I don't have any questions. Mark, did you want to add anything?
I do not have anything to add other than we might open up, see if there's just any general questions for ARMA, as ARMA in general, if there's anything anyone wants to ask before we come to a close. Looks like Steve's unmuted himself.
Yeah, I had one question for Lori. In your experience with the organizations that are undertaking an evaluation of digital preservation, where do you see that effort centralized? Do you see it in the law organization, in the records management type of area, IT? Can you give us a flavor for where that effort is concentrated?
Yeah, and I'm happy to say that I think it's changing over time. So, of course, the early adopters and the early strugglers with digital preservation technology come out of the archival and library community, or the cultural heritage, so museums, foundations, that sort of thing. Over time, so it's not uncommon to see the need come out of, say, in government records and archives, right? So they're aware of, their film vaults are decaying, or they've gone for grant money, and so usually records and archives. So in county government, it can be one or the other. Sometimes they're combined functions. In state government, we're still seeing it mostly come out from the state archives side. In academic institutions, it's
Did we lose Lori?
I'm wondering that. She's still showing us connected, but we're not hearing anything.
so a third party was involved in the
There she
process,
is.
but yeah, they took 30 million emails from Lotus Notes, shut down that application, and now access them through the preservation system. So we do see IT, they sort of get aware, but also compliance officers now. I spoke recently to law enforcement, and their use cases, they have these big video files from body cams and building securities that don't fit very well in their records management applications. And they need, transcripts and other sorts of rendering tools. So I'm happy to report the world of folks who are seeing the need for this is expanding beyond their traditional archival and library communities. So thank you for your question.
And Lori, we did, I think there may have been some technical difficulties somewhere along the line. We probably missed maybe half a minute of your response. So.
Oh, okay. So just in summary, typically libraries, archives, increasingly records managers, because they have the, they're looking at long-term and permanent records and seeing where film and paper are not working. But we do see queries from IT folks who get a requirement for, maybe from a state law that says this is what you have to do in this format under these conditions, can't be encrypted, needs multiple geographic locations. And then some from compliance, and more recently from law enforcement. So it's after a long time of talking about this, it seems to be opening up.
Okay, it doesn't appear to be any more questions for you, Lori. So just for the sake of time, we thank you for taking the time to present to us. And, hopefully in the future, I'm thinking we'll have you again as things progress in the digital world. So we definitely appreciate your knowledge base, and your willingness to share with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay. Okay, Mark, is there anything you want to add? I think if not, this probably concludes the presentation component. And the President, on behalf of ARMA, we thank you for your participation and look forward to our future meetings. We're not sure how our meeting will be conducted for October, but once that has been solidified, we will communicate that to everyone. So with that being said, this concludes our presentation, and for the remaining members, we will go right into our board meeting. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Yeah, I'll keep the go-to meeting operational for the board members. Thanks for everyone else participating, and everyone non-board can leave and you'll hear from us later. And looks like we are to the board members now.
Okay.
Is that, do you need to turn the recording off, Mark, or is that still
Oh
going to
yeah,
stay on?